listening to the Matt Burton Show. I'm your host, Matt Burton, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Jennifer DePaoli. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, ma'am. Jennifer is the Senior Education Advisor with Civic Enterprises. Jennifer, tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. I am a former teacher turned education researcher, and like you said, I am the Senior Education Advisor at Civic Enterprises, where we do research and consulting in the education field. And every year we put out the Building a Grad Nation report, which is the annual report to the nation on high school graduation rates.
Jennifer, is there a problem with high school graduation rates right now?
Well, actually, there's some really good news when it comes to high school graduation. For the third year in a row, we've set record high school graduation rates. This year, the latest graduation rate is 82.3%. which, like I said, is the highest that it's ever been. When you look across the nation, 29 of 50 states equal or exceeded that national average. So basically, most of those states are on pace to reaching a 90% high school graduation rate by 2020, which is our organization, and we are part of the Grad Nation campaign. That is our goal that we are moving towards, thankfully. So yeah, there's lots of good news when it comes to graduation rates. And just, we also like to look at in terms of students, the actual number of students that we need to graduate. And when you look at it, it really gives you a clearer picture of what we're dealing with. Based on this year's graduation rate, we would need about 285,000 more students to graduate in order to reach 90%. And so that seems like a pretty big number, but when you look at it, we like to say that that's like filling 3 Rose Bowls, right? And so it makes it seem much smaller when you actually look at that number. So a lot of positives. The one big issue that we're dealing with at the national level is just that this is the first year the graduation rate has put us off track to hitting 90%. We just below it. So everybody's going to have to put in extra duty to make sure that the nation remains or can get back on track towards reaching that goal.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. Is this because of charter schools and with other, more like private schools that's, doing this great effort, or is it other, or what's the numbers look that way with the other different types of schools?
Sure. So our analysis doesn't include private schools because they don't have to report federally, and we use federal data. But we do look in this report at alternative high schools, we look at charter high schools, and we look at virtual high schools, and in addition to just your typical traditional regular public high school. And, what we're seeing is that when you look across these different school types, especially when you look at, there's a lot of bad press in recent years around regular public high schools, and they're failing, but the majority of them are succeeding. Only 7% of a regular, traditional district high schools are actually low graduation rate schools. And so, we really do have to focus on that 7%, because it equals out to about 1,000 schools nationwide. And those schools need to be paid attention to, and they're obviously not helping us raise the graduation rate.
Really?
When you talk about charter schools, which is, and so they really are doing really well. And granted, when you think of traditional public schools, a lot of times we think of schools that are in cities that are failing, or maybe in rural areas that we think maybe might not have as high of graduation rates. But in reality, they make up the majority of schools, and they make up a really small percentage of the failing schools, when it comes down to it. So, we have to be really careful about how we talk about schools, because I think the prevailing notion that the majority of schools are failing is just not true. But that doesn't mean that we can just ignore the problem that there are schools that are still failing.
Sure. My mother was a school teacher, so my mother is very pro public education. I know that a lot of times.
And I think we all should be, because they are the schools that are primarily educating the majority of students in this country. Yeah. And there are a lot of really good ones, and I'm sure your mother would say the same thing. Yes. I was a public school teacher too. That there are a lot of really good ones, and we need to get off of this language that those schools are failing. But we do need to, like I said, I'll say it again and again. We need to focus on those ones that are struggling, and the ones that are struggling tend to be in urban areas. That's part of our analysis. More than 50% of the low graduation rate high schools that we saw were in cities. but only when you look at the percentage of where schools are, only a quarter of them are actually in cities. So a disproportionate amount are in these urban areas. And when you look at what those schools tend to deal with, we really have to be careful. It's usually not just a school problem. There's a lot of issues that those schools deal with that we need to make sure are, adequately addressed.
Right. Well, I know back in 2008 in the presidential election between Romney and Obama, that was a big topic of the school vouchers. Let's send our kids to private schools. Of course, President Obama was, hey, let's support public schools. Romney was for the, give the choice. Kind of funny that we're hearing this, because I think our American culture, we're just drilled into, well, private schools are the best, charter schools are the best, public schools are failing, and now your analysis shows that it's actually public schools are doing a lot better.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, there's still a high number. There's still too many public schools that are not doing well. But like you said, in our analysis, when we look at these low graduation rate schools, charter schools really show a pretty mixed picture. There are some really, really successful charter schools that we see, and there's some really, really, really bad charter schools that we see. So the picture on those schools are really mixed. And then you also brought up vouchers, which is not something that we talk about in our report, but is something that a lot of people are interested in. Using public money to send kids to private schools. When you look at the places that have invested in vouchers, and I happen to have spent a lot of time in one of these cities in Cleveland, Ohio, they're really not that successful. Yes, they provide students with a choice to get out of a school, but in my opinion, and I think in a lot of people's opinion, it would be, we think maybe it would be better to just invest that money into the public schools that are maybe not doing so well. But yeah, like I said, I think when we look at the schools in our report this year, the one type of school that we would come down on really hard and say this is a type of school that's really struggling, but yet we're seeing a lot of growth in this area in terms of more and more of these schools coming into existence, is in the virtual school category. I know where I live, you see commercials all the time for virtual schools, and right. They're advertised as being great places for kids who maybe are like lacking motivation, or maybe are not, don't deal well with the social aspect of schools. But in our analysis, we found that 87% of those schools are failing schools. And in a lot of states, nearly every one of them within a state is failing. And so, that's a school, that's an area where we're really strongly saying, hey, something needs to be done here. These schools are not succeeding. But like you said, it really is a mixed bag when it comes to some of these other types of schools. And so, I think it's really important that if a school, regardless of type, is working, then we need to look at it and say, what can we learn from this school? And really, I think our point with writing this wasn't to necessarily look at a certain school type and say this is bad or this is great, but saying, what are these schools doing that are doing really well? What can we learn from them? And, what do we need to really make sure students have? That's really I think one of the components that's missing from education discourse today is what is it that we know kids really need, and how can we make sure we give that to them, regardless of what type of school they're in. But at the same time, we do want to make sure that all of these school types are being held accountable,
right,
and that we're actually we're actually able to tell where there's success and where there isn't.
Right, because I know that the virtual schools, because I see a lot of this on TV and hearing people, and it's great because let's say that a child becomes pregnant in school or falls ill or something or gets a job or what have you, they can continue their education through these virtual schools. My problem is I went to online classes before, and if I don't have a teacher after me 24/7 to turn in an assignment or to show up for class, that way right there, because I think that maybe, and even homeschooling is, because it falls on the parents. Well, what if you have a lazy parent that's not really, you know what I mean? I don't know if that sounds horrible to say, but of course, like I said, I'm very pro public schools. How can they find your report so the listeners can read your full report?
Sure. So you can find our report on my organization's website, which is www.civicenterprises.net. You can also find it on www.gradnation.org, which is our campaign headquarter website. And there's lots of great information on there, and they can find previous year's reports. We also did state-by-state progress reports this year. So you can look up your own individual state and see how your state is doing on different factors that we find are important.
Well, very good. Jennifer, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of insight of the current state of our education, whether public schools and charter schools, alternative schools, and what have you. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed being on.
Thank you.